name is Charlotte Gray, and I write about history, Canadian history. And you may feel surprised to find that somebody who mucks around in the past is wrapping up an evening filled with aspirations for the future. Yes, we do desire a better country, and yes, it will take work as we face an aging population, slackening productivity, urban poverty, disastrous climate change, and more threatening global politics than most of us can recall in our lifetimes. And I haven't even mentioned the dangers of Trump creep. But one thing about being a historian is you learn to take the long view. History never repeats itself, but it does go in cycles. And Canada has weathered crises in the past, crises that would have shipwrecked other countries. When I immigrated here in 1979, this country was in the middle of a full-blown political crisis. Canada seemed to be on the brink of falling apart as Quebec separatists demonstrated in the streets. Robertson Davis, the author, had announced, "This is not a country you love, it's a country you worry about." How times change. Since then, we've survived 3 major economic crises, a huge demographic shift, surges of immigration from all over the world, and even the death of Leonard Cohen. We've also finally acknowledged that Canadians must do a lot of work to repair the relationship with the Indigenous people of this land. But we should pay attention to our history, especially given where we are tonight. We are, as you've heard several times already and know only too well to yourselves, we're in the cradle of Confederation, the city where back in 1864, 22 rather stuffy white men made a deal that glued together a bunch of British colonies that didn't even like each other very much. Back then, the Dominion of Canada was a poor and fragile construction that many people predicted would collapse. Today, it's among the most democratic and prosperous countries in the world. And you know, that evolution did not happen by accident, although it helped that the newly fledged country had vast amounts of extraordinarily beautiful geography and incredible natural resources. If we paid more attention to our history, we would know that modern Canada has a sturdy infrastructure thanks to a remarkable set of institutions. Among those institutions, I would include a public health care system that gives us access to medical care regardless of our ability to pay. I would also include our public schools, the most important route into mainstream Canada for thousands of newcomers. We also have a justice system that remains studiously non-partisan and uncorrupted, which is not a given in many countries, plus a Charter of Rights and Freedoms that guarantees the rights of the individual, usually the underdog, against the muscle of the state. Thanks to these institutions, there is a safety net for the vulnerable in our society. It is not infallible. Nets have holes. But it's there. And it's largely because a handful of remarkable thinkers kept pushing to ensure that Canada, this land of so much promise, became the country we know today. I'm thinking of people like Tommy Douglas, who championed Medicare, or Justice Bertha Wilson, who pushed to have the definition of individual rights in the Charter as expansive and inclusive as possible, or Senator Murray Sinclair, under whose quiet leadership the Truth and Reconciliation Commission opened our eyes to the appalling legacies of residential schools and the exclusion of Indigenous people from our national life. As Canadians, we are so bad at celebrating our heroes. Self-deprecation is a national characteristic. Tommy Douglas put it this way: "I don't mind being a symbol, but I don't want to be a monument. There are monuments all over the Parliament buildings, and I've seen what the pigeons do to them." But it took work by these individuals and many others to build these sturdy institutions that over time have helped to knit together those original British colonies, plus the vast expanses of the West and North, into the country we know today. But I want to return to the agreement made here in Charlottetown 153 years ago. That agreement enshrined a characteristic of this country that has perhaps been the most crucial element in our survival: the talent for compromise. From the start, this country was built on the recognition that its citizens would never all speak, pray, or look alike. Those two canny founding fathers, the French-Canadian leader Georges-Étienne Cartier and his English-speaking counterpart, John A. Macdonald, sold their colleagues on the idea of a federal system of government, which allowed people with different backgrounds, cultures, and legal systems to retain their individuality while sharing this land. That's what Confederation was all about: a federal umbrella for the whole country, coast to coast, but a second layer of provincial governments that allowed the component parts to set their own priorities. Now, the deal made in Charlottetown was not a perfect agreement. The voices of this continent's indigenous people were missing, but it did set a pattern for mutual accommodation that has proved extraordinarily resilient. It's not glamorous, but it keeps us between the guardrails as we hurtle ahead. When I arrived here in Canada 38 years ago, I found my new fellow citizens boringly polite. I got so frustrated because I come from a family and a society where sarcasm and outrageous jokes won kudos. But when I arrived here, I found that if I said anything provocative, nobody said, "That's rubbish." Instead, the reaction was always, "That's interesting." Or if it was particularly shocking, "That's different." On a sprawling landmass with few national connectors, politeness is part of the national glue. People in this country have always tried to accommodate difference because the alternatives are too dire to contemplate. In the years ahead, we need to hang on to that talent. Oh yes, and one more thing. So in 1979, Canada was on the brink of collapse, while I had left behind the so-called United Kingdom. Today, the United Kingdom is wobbling, and Canada has never looked so secure. History, as I said, goes in cycles, but it is because of our history that we have an excellent foundation on which to build a better country. Let's look to the future, but also recognize the good work of previous generations. Thank you.